Jonathan Pierce always believed leaving was the right choice. 20 years of wealth and success had given him everything, except peace. But when he sees her at the airport, time stops. Lauren, and beside her, a young man who is the mirror, image of himself, his son. Jonathan's heart pounds. They're leaving, maybe forever. He rushes forward, desperate to fix the past, but when he finally reaches them, the truth is more brutal than he ever imagined. Want to know what happens? Next, watch until the end and don't miss this emotional story full of twists and surprises. Jonathan Pierce had spent the last 20 years telling himself he made the right choice. He had built an empire from nothing. Skyscrapers bore his name. Entire industries thrived under his command. His face graced business magazines. His words moved markets. To the outside world, he was the definition of success. But in the quiet hours of the night when the city lights flickered beyond his penthouse windows, he knew the truth. Success was a hollow thing when regret lived in its shadow. There were nights when he dreamed of her. Lauren, with her soft laughter and steady heart. He had loved her once more than he'd ever admitted. And yet when she told him she was pregnant, something inside him locked up. Fear, doubt, the overwhelming certainty that he wasn't ready. He walked away. He told himself it was for the best, that she'd be better off without him. He had nothing to offer her. No stability, no certainty, no fatherhood worth having. But that lie had long since worn thin. He hadn't been protecting her. He had been protecting himself, and now, 2 decades later, he still couldn't escape the weight of it. So when his assistant handed him his itinerary that morning, a last-minute flight to London for yet another deal, he didn't think much of it. He moved through airports like he moved through life, efficiently detached, with purpose but without feeling, at least until he saw her. It was in the crowded terminal, past security, when his eyes caught a glimpse of something, someone he hadn't seen in 20 years. Lauren. Time had barely touched her. She was older, yes, but still carried that same quiet elegance, the same gentle confidence. But it wasn't just her that made his breath catch in his throat. Standing beside her was a young man, tall, broad-shouldered, dark hair, a posture that was eerily familiar. Jonathan felt the blood drain from his face, because in that instant he knew this wasn't just any young man. This was his son. Jonathan's breath turned shallow, his pulse hammering in his ears as he stared at the young man beside Lauren. He wasn't guessing, he wasn't hoping. He knew. The boy, no, the man, had his build, his sharp jawline, even the way he stood. Weight balanced slightly on one foot, like Jonathan himself always did. It was like looking at a reflection of his younger self, a version of him that had grown up without him. His stomach twisted. For 20 years he had buried the thought of what his child might have looked like. He had never searched, never allowed himself to wonder. That had been the deal, hadn't it? Walk away, don't look back. But now, here they were. A twist of fate had placed them in the same airport, breathing the same air, just a few feet apart. Swallowed hard, his mind scrambling to make sense of it. Had Lauren ever tried to find him? Had she told their son about him? Did the boy even know his name? A sudden wave of nausea hit him. What if he had never been more than a ghost to them, just a name on a birth certificate, an unanswered question? He watched as Lauren handed the ticket agent their passports. His eyes darted to the screen above the gate. Final boarding call for Flight 287, one way to Paris. Paris. Jonathan clenched his fists. They were leaving. Maybe for a trip. Maybe for a new life. Maybe forever. A panicked urgency gripped him. He had already let them walk away once. He couldn't do it again. He took a step forward, his mouth opening, but no sound came out. His heart slammed against his ribs. What could he even say? After 20 years of silence, what words could possibly undo what he had done? Lauren shifted, moving closer to the boy. And for the first time, the young man turned his head slightly, just enough for Jonathan to see his profile. And then the unthinkable happened. The boy's eyes flicked toward him, locking on his face. Not with curiosity, not with wonder, but with recognition. Jonathan stood frozen, trapped in the space between past and present, between who he had been and who he had become. His son was looking at him, not with confusion, not with idle curiosity, but with something far worse, recognition. Jonathan's chest tightened. He had never seen this boy before, never spoken to him, never so much as whispered his name in 2 decades. And yet the young man knew exactly who he was. How? Had Lauren told him? Had he seen pictures? Had he spent years wondering about the man who disappeared before he took his first breath, or worse, had he been waiting for this moment? Jonathan's throat went dry. He wanted to move, to speak, to step forward and close the impossible distance between them, but his body wouldn't obey. His son's expression didn't change. No shock, no anger, just an unreadable calm, like he had already made up his mind. About Jonathan a long time ago. That was what terrified him the most. Because if the boy had been surprised, if he had looked at Jonathan with even the smallest flicker of longing, then maybe there would have been hope. But there was none. Lauren turned, following her son's gaze, and when her eyes landed on Jonathan, the air between them shifted. For the briefest moment, something flickered across her face, something he couldn't name. A ghost of the past. A memory slipping through the cracks of time, but just as quickly as it came, it was gone. Her expression hardened, her posture straightened, and in that instant, Jonathan knew exactly where he stood. Lauren wasn't angry. She wasn't sad. She was indifferent, and that indifference cut deeper than any fury ever could. The boarding announcement echoed through the terminal. A final call, a countdown he hadn't known he was racing against. Lauren turned back toward the gate. His son did the same, and just like that, they were walking away, again. Jonathan's chest heaved. The moment was slipping through his fingers, just like it had 20 years ago, but this time he wasn't going to let it happen. He surged forward, his voice finally breaking free. "Lauren." She stopped. Slowly, she turned. Their son did too, and now there was no running from this. For the first time in 20 years, Lauren was looking at him, really looking at him, not as the man she used to love, not as the man who left, but as a stranger. Jonathan's pulse pounded in his ears. His mouth was dry, his hands clammy, sensations he hadn't felt since he was a young man scrambling for his first deal. Except this wasn't business. This wasn't money or power or strategy. This was his last chance. Lauren's eyes flickered with something unreadable before she spoke, her voice even, controlled. "What do you want, Jonathan?" His name on her lips sent a jolt through him, but it wasn't warmth he felt. It was the cold edge of reality. This wasn't a reunion. This wasn't forgiveness wrapped in a bow. This was a reckoning. He exhaled sharply, forcing the words out. "I didn't expect to see you." A bitter smile ghosted across Lauren's lips. "Neither did I." She shifted slightly, just enough for her son to step forward. Jonathan swallowed hard, forcing himself to meet the young man's gaze. He searched for something, some kind of invitation, some opening to speak. There was none. The boy stood tall, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Lauren turned toward him. "Ethan, this is Jonathan Pierce. Not your father, not the man. Who left us, just a name." Jonathan flinched. Ethan didn't. "I know who he is," Ethan said, his voice calm but firm. Jonathan's heart twisted. How long had Ethan known? Had he ever wanted to meet him? Had he ever imagined this moment? Before he could say anything, Ethan's gaze sharpened. "You're the man who left my mom when she was pregnant." The words hit like a sledgehammer. Jonathan felt his stomach drop, his breath hitch. There was no hesitation, no softness in Ethan's voice, just a simple, undeniable fact. And for the first time in his life, Jonathan Pierce, king of boardrooms, master of negotiations, had nothing to say. Because what argument could he make? What excuse could possibly change the truth? None. And Ethan knew it. Lauren knew it. And as the final boarding announcement rang through the airport, Jonathan realized, if he didn't find the right words now, he might never get another chance. Jonathan swallowed against the lump in his throat, but the weight of Ethan's words settled deep in his chest, heavy and unshakable. "You're the man who left my mom when she was pregnant." There was no accusation in Ethan's voice, no anger, no demand for an explanation. Just a fact. A fact Jonathan had spent 20 years trying to outrun, and now, standing face to face with the son he had never met, there was nowhere left to run. Lauren's posture was rigid, her eyes scanning, his face waiting. Was she waiting for him to deny it, to beg, to make excuses? But there were none. Jonathan cleared his throat. "Ethan, Ethan lifted a hand, not aggressively, just enough to stop him. "I don't need an apology." His voice was steady, calm. "I just need to know one thing." Jonathan braced himself. "Anything." Ethan held his gaze, unblinking. "Did you ever think about me?" The words cut through the chaos of the airport, slicing past the boarding announcements, the beeping of scanners, the chatter of passing travelers. For a moment, there was nothing else, just the question hanging between them, and the unbearable truth behind it. Jonathan's breath stilled. He had spent years pretending that chapter of his life was closed, that walking away had been a necessity, that looking back would have served no one, but that had been a lie. And now, face to face with the boy, no, the man he had left behind, there was no more room for lies. "Yes." His voice was raw. "I thought about you every single day." Ethan's jaw tightened, his expression unreadable. "Then why didn't you come back?" Jonathan's chest ached. There it was, the question he had never let himself ask. Why hadn't he? He could say he was scared. He could say he didn't think he was good enough, that he thought Lauren and Ethan deserved better, but none of that changed the outcome. "I was a coward," Jonathan admitted, "and that's something I have to live with." Ethan exhaled sharply, looking away for the first time. Lauren, too, lowered her gaze. Jonathan wasn't sure if his honesty made a difference, but at least, for the first time in 20 years, he had told the truth. The final boarding announcement rang overhead. Lauren shifted her bag higher on her shoulder. "We have to go." Panic tightened Jonathan's chest. Was that it? Was this how it ended? Ethan turned toward the gate, taking a step forward. Jonathan's heart pounded. He was losing them. Again. And if he didn't do something now, this time, it really would be forever. Jonathan had never begged for anything in his life. Not for his first investment. Not for the deals that built his empire. Not for the power that made him untouchable in boardrooms across the world. But none of that mattered now. Because for the first time, he was about to beg. Not for money. Not for success. For time. "Wait," he said, his voice hoarse. "Please." Lauren hesitated. Ethan did not. He kept walking, his long strides carrying him closer to the gate, closer to the plane that would take him halfway across the world. Jonathan felt his heart lurch. "Ethan," he called, stepping forward. "Just give me 5 minutes." Ethan stopped. Slowly he turned. Lauren glanced at her son, something flickering in her eyes. Concern, uncertainty. But she didn't speak. Ethan studied Jonathan for a long moment. Then, with an exhale, he nodded. 5 minutes. Jonathan swallowed hard, his hands shaking slightly. He had prepared speeches before, ones that closed billion-dollar deals, ones that turned competitors into allies. But now, standing in front of the only thing that had ever truly mattered, he had no script, no strategy, just raw, unfiltered truth. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he started, voice thick. "And I don't deserve your time. But I swear, to you, Ethan, I have never stopped thinking about you." Ethan's expression didn't change. "Thinking about someone and being there for them aren't the same thing." Jonathan flinched. "You're right." The airport around them blurred, the noise fading into the background. There was only this moment. "I was young," Jonathan continued, voice tight. "But that's not an excuse. I was selfish. I was scared. And I walked away from the only two people I should have held on to." His eyes flickered to Lauren, who remained unreadable. "And I regret it every single day." Ethan's jaw clenched, but he didn't look away. "I can't change what I did," Jonathan said, his voice breaking. "But if there's even the smallest chance, If you ever wanted to know me even a little, I'd do anything to prove I'm not the man I was back then." A long silence stretched between them. Jonathan held his breath. Ethan looked down, his fingers tightening around the strap of his carry-on. Lauren finally spoke. "That's not up to me." Jonathan's gaze snapped to her. She exhaled softly, then turned to Ethan. For the first time since this conversation began, Ethan looked uncertain. The gate agent made the final boarding announcement. The moment of truth had come. Ethan had to decide. Did he walk away forever, or did he take a chance on the father he never knew? Ethan exhaled sharply, his fingers gripping the strap of his bag like it was the only thing keeping him steady. Jonathan stood motionless, waiting for something, anything. A sign that this wasn't the end, that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't lost everything. Ethan's jaw was tight, his eyes shadowed with emotions Jonathan couldn't read. Anger? Hurt? Indifference? "I used to wonder about you," Ethan said, his voice quieter now. "When I was a kid, I used to imagine what kind of person you were. If you were some hero who had a reason for leaving, if maybe one day you'd show up and explain everything." Jonathan's stomach twisted. Ethan let out a dry, humorless laugh. "And then I grew up. And I stopped wondering. Because I realized something." He met Jonathan's eyes, and this time there was no doubt about the emotion behind them. It was cold. Final. A real father doesn't wait 20 years to show up. Jonathan flinched. "I don't need an apology," Ethan continued. "I don't need explanations. I don't need to hear that you regret it. That doesn't change anything." The final boarding announcement echoed overhead. Lauren shifted beside Ethan, her expression unreadable. Jonathan's chest burned. Ethan shook his head. "You don't get to say anything else." Jonathan felt the ground slip beneath him. Ethan turned, gripping the handle of his suitcase, and took a step toward the gate. Then another. Jonathan's heart pounded. "Wait!" Ethan paused just for a second. Jonathan swallowed hard. "Is this it?" His voice cracked, the weight of 20 years pressing down on him. "I don't get another chance." Ethan hesitated. Lauren looked at him then. Really looked at him. And for the first time there was something in her eyes that almost resembled sadness, not for herself, for him. Ethan inhaled deeply. "I spent my whole life without a father," he said, his voice steady. "Turns out I don't need one now." And with that, he walked away. Lauren gave Jonathan one last glance. Not in anger, not in hatred, just closure. Then she followed. Her son through the gate. The door shut behind them, and just like that, they were gone. Jonathan stood there, his breath coming in slow, uneven waves. For the first time in 20 years, he had faced his past. But sometimes, the past wasn't enough to fix the damage done. He had waited too long, and now there was nothing left to wait for. Jonathan stood in the middle of the bustling airport, but he might as well have been alone. The world moved around him. Families reunited, friends embraced, flights were called, but for him everything had just stopped. Lauren and Ethan were gone. For the first time there was no more what if, no more daydreams of second chances, no more illusions that one day he'd make it right. He had faced the past, and the past had turned its back on him. Slowly, his feet carried him to a row of seats near the window, where he sank down and stared at the runway beyond the glass. Somewhere out there, the plane carrying Lauren and Ethan was taxiing, preparing to lift off, preparing to take away the last chance. Jonathan exhaled shakily, running a hand over his face. He had built an empire. He had climbed to the top of the world, and yet sitting there in that airport he had never felt smaller. For a long time he didn't move, didn't check his phone, didn't think about work or meetings or deals waiting for him in London. None of it mattered. Not today, not anymore. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he stood. His legs felt heavy, his chest hollow, but he walked. Not toward security, not toward his own flight, but out. Out of the airport, into the open air, where the late afternoon sun was beginning to set, bathing the world in deep oranges and soft purples. He had spent 20 years pretending he had no regrets. That lie was gone now. So what came next? He didn't know. But for the first time in decades, Jonathan Pierce wasn't running from the past, and maybe, just maybe, facing it was the only way to start living again. The days that followed felt empty. Jonathan went through the motions, meetings, calls, business as usual, but something had shifted. The world he had built, the success he had spent decades chasing, all felt muted now, because for the first time in his life, he had lost something money couldn't fix. Ethan's words still echoed in his mind. Turns out, I don't need a father. Now. It was the truth, and the truth hurt, but at least it was real. One evening, a week after the airport, Jonathan sat alone in his penthouse, nursing a glass of whiskey, staring at the skyline. The city stretched before him, vast and endless, but he had never felt so small. Then his phone buzzed. At first he ignored it. Probably another business update, another deal in motion, but then he saw the name, unknown number. His chest tightened. He had stopped hoping. He had told himself there was nothing left to wait for. And yet, something in his gut told him to look. With a slow breath, he opened the message. I don't know why I'm texting you. Jonathan's fingers tightened around the phone. His heart pounded. Another message appeared. I don't know what I want from you, or if I even want anything at all. Jonathan swallowed hard. He forced himself to breathe, to not let hope explode inside him too fast. Then one last message. But I guess I just thought you should know. We landed safe. Jonathan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't a promise, but it was something. And for a man who had spent 20 years running from his past, something was more than he had ever expected. With unsteady hands, he typed a reply. Thank you for letting me know. He stared at the screen for a long moment before adding 2 more words. Words he should have said a long time ago. I'm here. He hit send, and for the first time in 20 years he truly meant it. Wow, what a journey. Life doesn't always give second chances, and when it does, they don't come easy. But sometimes even the smallest step, one message, one moment of honesty, can change everything. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the power of forgiveness, regret, or even the chances we let slip away, then stick around. We bring you stories that make you feel something, stories that stay with you long after the video ends. So if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss the next story, because who knows? The next one might just be the one you needed to hear today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.